Vocals are dynamic in nature, meaning that there are moments where a vocal might be very loud and forward, and other moments where a vocal might be quieter and harder to hear. This is ultimately a difference in dynamic range. This is where a compressor comes in. A compressor helps reduce dynamic range or reduce the difference in dynamic range. What that really means is it'll take the loud parts of a sound or of a vocal and reduce them when they become too excessively loud. And at the same time, it can add volume back to the quiet parts and therefore make them easier to hear. A compressor is really great for that because it can ultimately bridge the gap in volume between these two extremes and at the same time make your end listener be able to hear or perceive your vocal much more clearly, and that's why I like to use it. What's going on, everybody? This is your boy 5Piece, producer and engineer, and thank you for checking out this video and my channel. I'm going to show you how to set up a compressor on a vocal, and I'm going to be using my friend Cashflow's song, Floating. So I've got Cashflow's main vocal soloed here, and keep in mind that I am going to be preserving some of his reverb effects because I feel like that's important to the song and just understanding the vibe. However, I'm not going to have the instrumental or other components in here because I still want to be able to focus on listening for the dynamics of the vocal. That being said, let's talk about some settings. Now, the first thing you're going to want to dial in is the ratio. I recommend setting a lighter ratio. Typically, a 2-to-1 ratio is pretty good in terms of achieving a transparent sound from the compression. Remember, this is going to dictate how much gain reduction takes place on a sound. And with a 2-to-1 ratio, for every 2 dB of volume that goes in past the threshold, 1 is going to come out. So it's going to significantly reduce the volume, but not as significant as a 3-to-1, 4-to-1, and beyond. Next, we could dial in the attack and release. I'm going to leave them where they are right now, which is in the middle. So that means they're not necessarily fast or slow. It's just right in between both. We will come back and revisit these once we set our threshold, but I just want to make sure you set that up like this from the beginning because we're going to need to do this in order to get our sound. We're going to do the same thing with the gain. We're going to leave it at 0, but we will make up some gain later on once we have everything dialed in perfectly. So that leaves us with the threshold. The threshold, once again, is when this compressor will begin to work. Once the sound, the vocal sound, passes the threshold, it's going to kick this thing on and begin to reduce the volume, right? And if something doesn't pass the threshold, it's not actually going to work and it's not going to turn anything down. So as I set this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this and drag the threshold down. And as I do this, I'm going to look behind the ratio. There's a gain reduction meter. It's a little bar here, and it's going to light up every time there's some volume loss taking place. I'm going to look to get somewhere around 3 dB of volume, which may or may not be more aggressive than I would like, but that's okay because, again, we're going to dial in some other settings to make this sound a lot more smoother and more transparent. So let me play this, and let's look out for that 3 dB of gain reduction.
I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating. It's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating. It's so hopeless.
So that's pretty good. We're getting upwards of 3 dB, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, but that's how much volume is being shaved off of the peaks or the really loud moments, and it seems to be happening fairly consistently. However, we are going to want to dial back the attack and release now to make this sound smoother. Now, the attack, once again, is how fast this compressor is reacting, and right now you can see it's reacting to pretty much everything. So what I want to do is I want to slow it down, and by slowing it down, it's going to maybe not react so aggressively to the quieter moments like these, but then still affect these louder moments and reduce them as we need them to. So let me play this and just dial this back. And as I do this, I'm going to look to bring down this 3 dB reduction to now maybe more so closer to 2 on average, especially on those loud moments. Here we go.
I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating. It's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating. It's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating. It's so hopeless.
So slowing down the attack has definitely made this sound a bit smoother and react less aggressively in the process. You can hear on the louder moments, such as the beginning here, we're getting upwards of 2 dB of gain reduction, which is probably the most significant throughout this entire performance. However, during the quieter moments and at the end, for example, you can see that we're losing maybe 1 dB of volume at most, so it's not reacting the same way, and at the same time, it's starting to sound more transparent and smooth. Now, the next thing we want to set up, or readjust, I should say, is the release, and what we want to do is the opposite of the attack. We don't want to slow it down. In fact, we want to actually make it quicker because that's going to now allow the compressor to not keep things compressed or reduced for too long, right? If we keep it compressed or reduced for too long, it might actually reduce something such as this quieter moment when it doesn't necessarily need to be because the compressor is lingering essentially. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to reduce the release so it's faster, but not necessarily the fastest setting. There is a problem with that at times in the sense that it does create some sort of distortion. It really depends on the material, but I don't advise going to the fastest setting. I recommend going close, but not all the way. But that being said, as we set this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to now pay attention once again to the gain reduction that's taking place, and I'm going to listen at the same time and make sure that it's only reducing the louder moments and it's not lingering. It's not keeping them compressed. It's not keeping the quiet moments that follow them compressed, but rather just the peaks when I hear them, right? Whenever something is excessively loud or whenever something is noticeably loud, that's what should be getting reduced. These quieter parts, they should not necessarily be getting reduced to the same degree. So let's try this out.
I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless.
So you should have been able to tell that this gain reduction was taking place, but it was letting go fairly quickly. It wasn't keeping things suppressed for too long, and it was really just compressing or reducing the volume of these excessively loud peaks as mentioned. So reducing the release is the best way to ultimately achieve a smoother and more transparent sound. Now, with all that out of the way, before we add some more makeup gain to compensate for what we're losing, let's just hear how this thing sounds with and without the compression. So let me play it without.
I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel nothing, I'm just floating, it's so hopeless.
Thankfully, there isn't that big of a difference between these two. You could definitely tell that the uncompressed version is a little bit more dynamic, but ultimately they're very comparable in volume, and I could definitely say that the compressed version, even though it's not as dynamic, it does feel more forward, and that's one of the benefits of using compression, is it's going to push things up a little bit more and make them easier to hear overall, and that's ultimately why we're using it. Now, that being said, let's talk about adding some makeup gain to compensate for what we're losing, and I think this is a part where a lot of people mess up. Don't add too much makeup gain. Don't excessively slam it and make up more than what you're losing. In fact, you see that I was losing somewhere between 1 and 2 dB. I'm inclined to add just 1 dB of makeup gain back. You should be adding this back based on how much you are losing, and even though I am losing 2, that's only happening on the excessively loud moments. It's not happening throughout the entire thing. Throughout the entire thing, I'm more consistently losing 1 or less dB, so therefore a 1 dB gain is probably going to be pretty significant if I even need to do that. I might actually need to reduce this even more and have it be adding maybe a 0.5 dB, but as you can tell, we're ultimately trying to match whatever we are losing. That being said, let's now play this, and I'm going to A-B. Now, when I A-B, what I'm listening for is when I put the compressor in, it should not be significantly louder than the uncompressed version. In fact, it should be matched in volume, but it should still sound more forward, okay? We're ultimately just listening to see, does it sound more forward, but without being too excessively loud. So let me play this and put it in.
I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it.
Now, truthfully, this 1 dB gain is fairly close, but I still think it's a little bit too loud. So I'm going to play this one more time and just reduce it a little bit. And again, I'm just listening to make sure that we are ultimately matching the volume. So when I take this out, there's no noticeable volume increase or decrease. It should be very much the same, but the only thing that'll be different is there's going to be a little bit of a different timbre or tone or slight shift from that POV. So let's check this out.
I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating, like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it. I don't feel alive, I'm just floating. Like I got a life and don't own it.
I think this is significantly closer. Sure, it's a bit of a weird number being a decimal, but that's okay. We're not really focused on the number. We're focused on the sound and the perception. You can definitely hear how Kaj's voice comes more forward as a result of this, just the compression in general, not just the gain. And when I A-B with the compressed and uncompressed version, it's really just a difference of how forward his vocal is and not really a difference of volume. We can clearly perceive what he is saying, the loud stuff, the quiet stuff, and this gain is really benefiting the quiet stuff, especially because they're not going to be getting reduced as much as the louder parts. However, by adding this back, it's still going to allow those louder parts to cut through and not be too noticeably different in terms of loudness. Hopefully that makes sense, but ultimately we're just trying to match everything with the gain. And don't be afraid as you adjust these settings, these different parameters, to go back into a previous one and adjust it even more. Sometimes you adjust the attack and release and you need to adjust the threshold a little bit more. Sometimes you do that, you got to adjust the gain. It's not a big deal if you have to adjust these different things. You're ultimately trying to achieve the best sound, but hopefully these different tidbits of advice have been helpful and you have a better understanding of how to use a compressor in your mix. Now keep in mind that I've focused on downward compression in this video. This is the most common form of compression that you're going to want to use in a mix. However, there's many different other forms of compression out there, from multi-band to sidechain to parallel to upward and beyond. There's all these different types of compression that you can utilize in a mix, and they're all a little bit different from one another, but follow the same type of principles. That being said, if you want to learn more about these different types of compression, go to the description down below. I've left a bunch of links there for you to check out. I highly recommend you watch each one, as it'll give you a lot more information and knowledge on how to use compression in your own mixes. Now, that being said, we've reached the end of the video. I appreciate you watching. If you haven't done so already, please smash that like button until it turns blue, and definitely consider subscribing if you haven't yet, as well as tapping that bell so you can get notified every time I drop a new video. I drop one every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing y'all again on the next one. All right? Peace.
5,